So if it is true that Harvard is trying to unload some private equity or venture investments on the secondary market, well, I'm sure there's a Wall Street for that.
Okay, folks, we're going to get started here. Our 4:30 panel, we have endowment investing and university finances. Pretty exciting, sexy topic right now. On this panel, we have Tad Smith, class of '87, is a senior partner at One Roundtable Partners, which he co-founded. He was previously the CEO, among other things, Tad. You're the CEO of two very well-known New York Stock Exchange listed companies, Madison Square Garden and Sotheby's. And we also have Joe Quintilian. Joe's a partner at Distributed Capital Partners and a co-founder at Anja Labs, LLC. Joe's going to tell us a bit more about that. These gentlemen are both steeped in the cryptocurrency world, but we're going to start a little bit more broadly first. So Tad, you, by the way, Tad not only being from the class of '87, also into Harvard Business School. Let's step back and talk about all this exciting news around these universities being defunded. These research grants are being slashed. In fact, I met someone at the Yankee Doodle tap room last night, a paleontologist, and he was very angry about the situation. He said, why can't we just have them give us money and let us do our thing? So Tad, what do you have to say about this?
This is where I get to pretend like I'm Rafiq and I don't get the, no filming. Is that Exactly. I'm going to adopt the Goldman compliance department. Well, for those of you who haven't been checking your phones, you probably noted that the Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem delivered a little notice to Harvard today that essentially evicts all their foreign students. I'm actually not kidding. It's in your New York Times article. It's the lead article for the day. So it is an interesting time to think about this. And what I would say is this. There is a really interesting dimension that we have sort of gotten very comfortable with over many, many years about allowing, and the prior panelist said this very gently, I'll say it a little bit more sharply, the regulatory state to influence a large number of private sector decisions. And that's been just fine as long as we like what their influence is. And what you're seeing right now is a lot of instances where folks are getting a lot of changes from a new administration with a very different tone and a very different approach, and they're finding how problematic the touch points that the regulatory state has imposed on them over years, creeping very gently over time, create problems for it. And the panel before the last one, or maybe two panels ago, there was another gentleman who made the point how flexible the law has become on these various things. And when you think about the combination of flexible and not necessarily clear jurisprudence combined with, by the way, venue shopping, a creeping regulatory state, and a sharp change in the way the regulatory state is operating, it creates enormous problems for institutions like my alma mater, actually both of my alma maters. And that's why would we expect that to be any different for the endowment part of the alma mater? We shouldn't, and it isn't.
Great. So Tad, another thing that's happened that you've read about in the newspapers is a lot of these endowments adopted what's called the Yale model, which is going into private equity and other illiquid assets. And we've also heard rumblings about some of these needing to be sold. And I always think when I hear that, if the whole world knows you're trying to dump this stuff, that's not a good sign because the bid's going to shrink away. So the question, a long way of asking Tad, is were we wrong to adopt the Yale model and get into all this illiquid stuff, or was this just bad luck?
Well, also, sometimes very, very good ideas simply outlive themselves. So that's another, let's add that as a third possibility. I think the regime, and again, prior panels have talked about this, but the regime of, and a very long regime indeed, up to 22, 23, of easy money, negative interest rates, relatively no covenant type debts, powerful influence for positive growth in venture capital and private equity over very, very long periods of time, was an absolutely garden variety invitation to come in and expand into alternative assets. And frankly, why wouldn't you? You should. It would be the irrational thing to do not to do so. But those regimes have changed very rapidly, and the institutions themselves, the endowments themselves, are very slow to change. And more importantly, with respect to that, I would say the slow to change aspect of it affects not just the endowment, but the entire institution.
Yeah.
When you think about it, there are very few institutions larger than these. These are huge corporations. They don't have activists. I mean, there's one activist that's sort of noisy about it, but they don't have activists. And they are slow to change. And the environment is changing very rapidly around them. And more importantly, I would say it's accelerating. The change is accelerating, and they're caught flat-footed. So if it is true that Harvard is trying to unload some private equity or venture investments on the secondary market, well, I'm sure there's a Wall Street for that.
Great. All right, let's get Joe into the conversation here. Again, Joe Quintillion, partner, Distributed Capital Partners. Joe, by the way, is a Bucknell graduate. He's got some thoughts on his university or his alma mater's finances. But first, Joe, talk a bit about what you do, and also what's the role of cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, Ethereum probably, in endowments?
So it's only been a small portion of endowments that have gone into Bitcoin and ETH. And it's actually, going back to your point on slow endowments moving slow, the only endowment that has bigger than 5% allocation is Stanford's student investment fund has 7% in it. So it's the ability to change and see how technology is going ahead. The endowments are very, very slow. The other big endowment that has it is University of Texas with Joe Lonsdale at Alston. And my industry has been nascent, very small in the beginning, but everybody's been saying everybody hates Bitcoin from the beginning. Now Bitcoin's 110,000. Everybody loves it. So I remember when I got into the business, I was the first one ever to file for the ETF, and I got laughed out of the SEC, and ETH was $5. Think about how much I could have delivered an ETF at $10, and the SEC didn't want to believe in ETH or Bitcoin, and this is 2018. Sometimes the regulatory regimes that we have, they are very slow, and they don't adjust to what's happening. And wait till AI is going to hit right now. It's crazy.
Yeah.
So
the irony about that, just can I chime in?
Yeah.
The irony about that is many of the endowments reject Bitcoin. I'll just use Bitcoin as an example, as you well know, because of the volatility. The same endowments, by the way, who are scrambling for cash now.
at least with Bitcoin, you can borrow against it.
It is liquid.
You can borrow against it.
Even on Saturday night.
Yeah.
Now, Tad, your colleague, DTAP, who went to Lawrenceville down the road, which, by the way, has $1 billion endowment. I can hardly believe that. It's a high school.
And Brown, by the way. He's a fine Brown graduate.
All right. Now, I think that Dan encouraged Lawrenceville to dip its toe in cryptocurrency, which probably has done quite good things for them in the last few years. But what's your view on what I just asked Joe? Basically, like, I mean, is there's a trade-off, right? I mean, it's diversification, but there's volatility. What do you think, Ted?
Well, the thing that's interesting, in almost any other year, what I'm about to say would sound perfectly reasonable, and today it's going to sound crazy because of what's going on with the endowments. If you looked for an institution that was broadly interested, has a relatively low cash requirement each year, very predictable over very long periods of time, and at the same time really is interested in capital appreciation. And by the way, because the amount of the cash required, generally set by the IRS and other things, is steady and predictable, you would expect that kind of an institution to have as much or take on as much volatility as possible in at least some classes of assets. Why? Because volatility, as we all know, on the downside is stopped really at zero unless you're nakedly shorting or something crazy like that, or writing open calls, uncovered calls, stuff that honestly endowments don't do. But on the upside, it's infinite. And that's one of the reasons why there's a great enthusiasm for tech stocks, right? Essentially, they're call options on an uncertain future, which is why the valuation of the earliest stage tech is much, much greater than the later stage, because there's a bounding around what the outcomes are. The reason I say that is, if what I just said is true, the cash is predictable and they know exactly what they need, and they would actually be interested in capital appreciation, what finer asset could you have than one that is now has the imprimatur of the regulators and is the fastest racing horse of all asset classes? I don't know. Now, I'm not talking go out and buy a meme coin.
Right.
But let's start with IBIT or any of the ETFs. And IBIT, I mentioned that one because it's actually, it has Larry Fink's imprimatur.
And that's a great answer, Tad. A quick follow-up to that, as we're talking about the portfolios within these endowments, how much should we know? How much should be disclosed? Should, if Princeton decides we like Bitcoin, or maybe even we like blockchain companies, something like that, do we deserve to know about that as donors to the endowment?
I think so. Yeah, they should be full disclosed on everything. They have to show every meme, like not ETH or Bitcoin, but they should be disclosure on how much is in U.S. equities, emerging markets, now private equity, venture. I think that's fair. Well, one thing I want to throw out, we didn't talk about, I think this is a very smart move by Trump, because Trump's biggest donors are Harvard alums. One of the biggest Harvard alum is actually Ken Griffin from Citadel, and also Henry Paulson. Bill Ackman, also Paulson.
You mean John Paulson?
John
Paulson.
Our neighbor.
John Paulson. Sorry. So I think this is, and you look at the board of overseers, they're all Democrats. There's not one that's going to stand up, and maybe Kenneth Channel up to him. The rest is are people who are not going to put their reputation on the line to go and stand up to Trump. So Trump sees easy pickings and has the Harvard people behind him saying, "Go ahead."
All right. Let's go back to stepping away from investing for a moment. Let's talk some big picture stuff. The tax-exempt status that these universities enjoy is under threat. Is it fair that they have a tax-exempt status? Should there be any limitations on that? Ted?
Wow. Yeah, this is the Sparky panel, right? Is that right? Crazy. Well, listen, there is in fact a proposal that was just put to the House, I think yesterday, the day before. It's reported also that the Republicans are now interested in potentially taxing large endowment firms. We'll see whether that goes anywhere. I suspect it won't, but we'll see. And in terms of my opinion, I think it's very difficult to differentiate a school from a church, from a synagogue, from a mosque, from an NGO, from all the community organizations that we do. You could say, well, we could do it by the size of the endowment, and clearly that's where they're going. And we should definitely consider that. I don't think it's appropriate, as I hinted at earlier, that the regulatory state be telling Princeton or frankly Harvard how to run those institutions. I don't. I think it's wrong. But interestingly, that's the regulatory regime in which we live, and live by the sword, die by the sword.
Great.
I actually think there could be something in between where you can go and say, there's so many faculty on staff. Right now, Harvard has more administrators than students. And that's just a little ridiculous. So I looked at the stat up, and Bucknell is very close too. That there has to be a limit on how many administrators you have compared to faculty. I believe in we should be putting more faculty members, more research together. We're in Princeton, where Albert Einstein was during World War II, right? So you want the research at the universities, but the administrative staff is turned way too much.
That's a great point, Joe. I mean, Ted, let me just follow up on that real quick. The gentleman who I mentioned yesterday, this Princeton paleontologist, he said the same thing. He said, well, I'm doing research. I thought this was the deal. I dedicated my life to this, and now everything's been turned upside down. And who are all these administrators? So How did that happen? Has it always been that? Has it always been that lopsided, or do the administrators just grow and grow and grow? And how can that self-correct without something like what we're seeing happening? Ted?
Well, I think if you look at the facts, and I haven't seen them in a while because I don't study this sort of thing, but the number of administrators, I graduated in 1987 from here and 92 from Harvard, and the number of administrators as a percentage of the total staff has grown over that period of time for almost all institutions. But I don't think it's necessarily clear that we should blame the institutions themselves. Because if we look carefully underneath the economics of the institutions and the economics of the endowments, what you might find lurking is significant federal subsidies going into the higher education space for many, many years, and significant efforts on the part of the regulatory state to influence them, and also, frankly, to require that they meet certain obligations with respect to grants or with respect to student loans or all sorts of other things. And that invariably, as we were talking about earlier with our friend from Goldman, involves compliance. So why should we be surprised that the number of people required, honestly, at some of these institutions to meet all of those and frankly to accomplish all the ends that they're trying to do requires more people as administrators? I'd be shocked if it didn't.
All right, guys, I think we got to move on to the next panel. That was terrific, gentlemen. Thank you so much. That was great.